self-sacrifice with boundaries. There is a schema that the book talks about that is called self-sacrifice. And for those of us who are disciples of Jesus, we know a lot about what the Bible says about self-sacrifice. It is constantly in front of us, right? We're called to deny ourselves and die to ourselves and lay down our lives for our friends. And those are all good things. But there's an unhealthy self-sacrifice that we can breed in our children and we can have ourselves when we don't have boundaries. And so our kids, if they don't have this core emotional need met, can feel guilty for thinking, I'll meet the needs of others without ignoring my own needs at the same time. So they won't feel guilty thinking that, is what I meant to say there. They'll be able to think it's normal to expect that my needs should also be met just as much as the next person. And although there will be many times when it's good to serve others, without expecting anything in return. So, we do want our children to learn the value of self-sacrifice and laying down their lives for others. But also knowing that there are limits to that to keep themselves healthy. And, I don't know if you've ever fallen into that trap. I actually know, some folks, even in this room, that have gone to that place of giving, and in the act of giving, they've actually sacrificed the needs of other parts of their life. Sometimes they've sacrificed the needs of their spouses. Sometimes they've sacrificed the needs of their children. And so self-sacrifice is good, but we also need to recognize that we have needs as well, and it's okay for them to be met. It's not selfish to think, I want people to meet my needs, or I want God to meet my needs, or I need people to meet my needs. So it's important. A special note here is if you have a child, we talked about temperament a little bit, but our children come into the world with different temperaments, and some of them are naturally more compliant than others. And so the ones that are more compliant, it's easy for them to give, and we can sometimes take advantage of that. Not necessarily on purpose, not because, we're bad parents and, we just want to take advantage of our kids, but, oops, sorry.
It's all right, Damien.
That's
a little gracious.
But, we need to help them understand, too, that they have a limit, not necessarily in being compliant, but, that it's okay for them to have time for themselves and to be able to take care of themselves. So, those are the things that are at stake. And I'm sorry here because I've lost my, there we go. Can't move my thing along. All right, here we go. All right, so let's get into the meat, which is really the practical side of things. How are we going to meet this core emotional need? As you can see there's a whole section, or chapter in the book called is Parents' Involvement, is it an asset or a liability? So that might be interesting to hear you, or to see that, to think of, that our involvement in our children's lives could actually be a liability to them. But there are ways that it can be a liability, and these are the ways that we can see that. I gotta stop messing with this thing. Sorry, guys. I have notes on here, so what I'm trying to do is track my notes on here without having to use the paper notes, but I'm going to move over to my paper notes so I don't have to keep messing with that thing.
Amen.
It's all right, bro.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so first of all, we've talked a lot about this over and over again, but when we have two parents in the household, when a parent's marriage is unhealthy and it's not doing well, that can be a liability for our children and our involvement in their lives. We can't stress, the importance of working on your marriage first if it's not going well. Because we can really go after doing these different things, these practical things to meet the needs of our children, but if our marriage is floundering, we could be Xing out, basically canceling out a lot of what we're doing with our kids. Because for two-parent households, those are the most important people in their lives. And to see, deterioration in the relationship, to see the relationship not healthy and not strong is going to be detrimental to our kids. And so there's a lot of studies that you can read in the book, if you have the book, that speak to the fact that children who have families where healthy marriages are happening tend to fare better in almost every area of life. Cognitively, emotionally, behaviorally. They tend to achieve higher academic scores in individual subjects, higher grade point averages, and are less likely to engage in negative and disruptive behaviors, as well as less likely to have emotional problems. And so one fact that's really important is to recognize that children whose fathers have died do better in school than children whose parents are divorced. That's a pretty powerful statistic, and the reason why they think that is it's speculated that children are able to attribute a more positive meaning to death than they are to a separation of a relationship of the two people they love. So you can see that's very powerful. The meaning that gets attached to a deteriorating marriage for their kids, it really does make a big difference. Now, as we say, all this, I do want to remind again that, if you're not in a situation where you're in a two-parent household, and maybe you're co-parenting or you're a single parent, this doesn't mean you can't successfully meet the needs of your children.
Right.
You have to work that much harder because you're in it maybe by yourself, or you're not in it together all the time. But it is possible, and especially with God's strength and God's grace and God's people behind you, it's all the more going to be successful. And so I never want to, ever communicate that it's not possible outside of that two-parent household. But that is very important. Another way that it's a liability is when parents constantly criticize. So we've talked about exasperating our children. So there are lots of ways that we can exasperate our children. One of the premier ways that consistently comes up in exasperating our children is belittling. And belittling is a very strong way of being critical of our children and putting them down. But we have to watch how we interact with our children. Children learn from their parents. They see how parents convey their expectations, the quality of relationship that they have with them, and whether the child feels accepted after they make mistakes. And the way we communicate that is so critical. I'm just going to jump ahead real quick to this scripture because I think it's very applicable here. Is Romans 15, verse 7. That speaks to Christians, but it really can apply to our relationship with our children as well, which is accept one another then just as Christ accepted you in order to bring praise to God. This idea of being accepting, taking our children for who they are. Obviously, while training them up in the way of the Lord and having reasonable limits and expectations for them, but really accepting who they are, and that includes accepting when they make their mistakes and they fail. They can be great learning opportunities, great ways to teach our kids, or times to teach our kids problem-solving skills, but really, accepting them is going to be the foundation of our children really excelling and meeting the expectations we place before them, the school environment places before them, eventually their workplace places before them. It's rooted in this feeling of being accepted and being accepted. So I just wanted to point that out in terms of, how we respond to our kids. Are we critical of them? And then lastly, we can be a liability when the quality of our relationship is poor with our children. And, again, that's just foundational. So really, in my mind, and really what the Louis put forth in the book, is that if you are not connected and you are not in a healthy relationship with your kids and not spending that quality time, not being empathetic, not really, being with them in the way you need to be, that's number one place to start. kids. If these other areas are off, hey, we need to work on that too, but you got to get your connection together first. It's absolutely necessary, and it's godly. That's the number one thing that God does for us, is he connects with us. He accepts us before he expects anything from us, which is pretty amazing. I know sometimes we can get that twisted in our minds. Yeah. We can think, well, God expects all of this before he'll accept me. And before he'll want to have a relationship with me. But actually, it's quite the opposite. Amen. God reaches out to us, extends his love, his mercy, and his grace, and then he lays out what he expects and what he wants from us. But he also gives us the means to actually do those things too, to meet those expectations. So all of that relates to our relationship with our kids. We've got to have a great relationship with them. It really does matter. So I don't know about you, but I don't want my relationship or my parenting to be a liability for my children. And I don't think anybody out there does either. So let's talk about how we can be an asset for our children. The first thing is to set learning goals, not performance-oriented goals. Okay? That might not sound, that might not make sense when you first read that. Because when I first read that, I was like, wait a second, aren't those kind of the same things? But they're not. Because performance-oriented goals is always concerned with the outcome. What's the product? What's produced? What did they actually accomplish? Versus what have they learned? And are they one step closer or one step farther ahead to where they need to be in their growth? That's what a learning-oriented goal is versus a performance-oriented goal. There is a world-renowned psychologist named Dr. Carol Dweck, and you may have heard of her. She's actually pretty well known in the world of psychology, and especially when it comes to studying out motivation. And in her studies of motivation, her work has part of her work has distinguished two general orientations that parents have with their kids when it comes to expectations. On the one hand, parents will encourage their children to focus on learning for learning's sake. And that's a parent that's focused on learning goals. So the fact that learning is really quite natural to our children, a learning-oriented parent capitalizes on that, realizes that our kids are naturally curious. It's unfortunate, and I've worked in the school system, I've worked with kids in my current job as a counselor, and it's unfortunate when children don't have an interest in school, and they don't want to go to school. And I've had kids as young as kindergarten and first grade that already feel like they don't want to go to school, and they're already fighting their parents tooth and nail about going to school. And, unfortunately, a lot of those kids have a reason why they hate school. And it's not because they're a bad kid, and they're so disobedient, and they're so disrespectful. Unfortunately, some of them have a really bad experience early on in life, maybe partly in the home. That's probably a big part of it, not having this learning-oriented atmosphere to grow up in. But sometimes the academic world is not learning-oriented either. Unfortunately, there's so much competition to be performance-oriented and to produce and to have certain scores and to pass your SOL test and to pass your SATs and all these things that over time people get, and our children get burnt out with school. And they get burnt out with the concept of learning. And it's no longer interesting, and that natural curiosity that God has given all of us dies a little bit inside. The other type of parent is the performance-oriented kind who pushes their children to attain high grades. They push them to, I'm reading from the wrong line. I was like, that's pretty good. They believe that success and performance signifies competence and a high degree of intelligence. They feel that having a highly intelligent child brings personal recognition. So we talked about that last week, I think, watching your own agenda.
All right.
Or maybe 2 weeks ago. and they have a desire for that kind of recognition. The parents do. They expect their children to secure a prestigious job and earn a high salary. So, in all of that, they're focused on the outcome and where they're going. And again, a lot of that can be guided by what the world considers as successful. And so we have to be mindful of that when we're performance-oriented, we may actually be doing the opposite of what we think we're doing. We're pushing our kids to be great in some way, whether it's academically or athletically or in their talents. And realistically, we're actually doing quite the opposite. We're burning them out. We're causing unnecessary stress and anxiety. There's studies actually in the book that in Asian countries where there's a high standard, like exaggerated standard of success academically, that there's increasingly high suicide rates among their students or among the kids and young adults. And that's very much, attributed to many things, but could be attributed to the fact that there's this performance-oriented, exaggerated expectation of success. We don't want to push our kids to that level. Again, that proverb that we read earlier on, we want our kids to not be too poor, not to be too rich, be right where God wants them to be. So we center ourselves on being learning-oriented versus performance-oriented. We help our kids in that way, and we're an asset. Secondly, they do not punish, praise, or reward in a controlling or conditional way. The most powerful and healthy form of motivation, as I've already mentioned, is intrinsic motivation. So that means that we're motivated to do an activity for its own sake or for the reward that's inherent in the activity itself. And that's what we want our children to be. That's what we want to be, honestly. I mean, how many of us have felt burnout in a job or with school or even spiritually because we're so focused on the performance orientation, like we just mentioned, that it's an externalized motivation. It's an extrinsic motivation. And we lose faith. We lose hope. We don't perform as well because of the fact that we're so focused on the external. And we often talk about, my heart's not in it. I just don't feel behind it, and there's truth to that.
Yeah.
And God wants us to be intrinsically motivated. God has given us grace and love and mercy for that reason, so that we would be motivated by those things and the joy of taking part in the life that God has given us versus any kind of external, level of achievement. So we have to watch out in the way that we punish, praise, or reward our kids in a controlling way. It's interesting because even rewarding our kids, you might think punishing, okay, yeah, I don't want to punish my kids in a way that controls or is sending a message to them that my love or my thoughts about them are conditional. But even rewarding and praising can send that same message. There's another researcher, I think his name is Deci or Decky. I'm not sure how it's D-E-C-I. And he did work on motivation as well. What he found was that motivation through rewards over time actually did not promote an excited state of learning, but a sad state of apathy. So when we use a lot of externalized motivation to get our kids to do things, and we don't capitalize, and unfortunately, if we're not doing this at an early age, we actually set ourselves up for failure later on. And we have a hard time doing this, and we see this in schools all the time with kids in the middle school and high school years. If they haven't gotten that intrinsic motivation in the elementary school years, it's really hard. And you're working uphill. It's not impossible. But it's an uphill battle. So for those of you who have young children and are just starting out, encourage you to be learning oriented and to watch how you use praise and reward. Using it sparingly well, I shouldn't say sparingly, because you want to praise and you want to recognize the work that your children are doing, but doing it in such a way that's very focused and targeted, and not just kind of general. So, an example of something general is, oh man, great grades, you're really smart, kid. That might sound really nice and sound very kind and even thoughtful, but that's very general and very generic. And so what our kids hear over time is, well, I'm a great kid, I got great grades, so that makes me a great kid, but we're not focusing and targeting that praise and reward for very specific things that we see them doing in their progression, in their development, in their learning. Targeting what it is that they did great on is much, is going to really fortify that intrinsic motivation that much more. So we want to be able to focus our praise in such a way that it's not conditional, but actually is very specific, and gives them good direction. And then lastly on here it says that the parents are an asset when they focus on who the children are and not what they do. So when they focus on the inside and not the outside. When we praise our children for doing something well because of the effort they put in, we should do so without making any comparison with others. These are the kinds of things that, here are some examples of basically praise that can focus on what our children do other than who they are. So, you made us proud by becoming first in class. You made us happy by doing what you should, like we expected. You made us look good because you scored straight A's. You were the best actor or actress in that entire play. You're the smartest in your class. These things focus on what the children do in a way that isn't helpful for them to build that confidence and self-esteem and intrinsic motivation. Sorry.
It's all right, you're on a roll. Keep going.
All right, get it together. I'm going to get it together. So here are the things that we can really look out for, that we can really look out to for praising our children, and it focuses on who they are, their character, not what it is that they do. So for instance, looking out for them being helpful when they're helpful and recognizing that. Wow, I really saw how you helped your brother or your sister when they were struggling with tying their shoes. Great job. I appreciate that. When they're being empathetic, I noticed how you saw your friend, was kind of feeling left out and sad, and you went over and you went and played with them, and you brought them in to your game that you were playing. That was really great how you did that. When they're being cooperative, when they're cooperative with their siblings, when they're cooperative with their friends, when they're cooperative with you, recognizing that. When they make effort, the fact that they're working hard. Maybe they're not making A's and B's like the world says that's what they have to be doing to be successful, but they're putting in the work, the effort, and you see them going after it, and instead of saying, man, you need to work harder to get some A's on your report card, is, wow, I see how hard you're working, and I know you really want that A, and just keep at it, and you'll get there. It's going to happen. When they're joyful. Sometimes we don't think about recognizing those kind of things. When they're joyful or they're at peace. We recognize when they're unhappy, and we recognize when they're causing a tornado storm in our home, but we don't always recognize, like, wow, you just seem really calm today, and the way you you just carry yourself is just, you seem really at peace, bud. I appreciate your smile. I appreciate how you're laughing today and making me laugh. I appreciate how you've been patient. waiting while we've been standing in this grocery line for 10, 12 minutes, or whatever line that you might be waiting in. So all these different ways is really focused on their character and who they are as a person, rather than what it is that they're doing.
Yeah.
And we want to focus on that. Some other ways we can be an asset is to consider the fact that our children are not intelligent all in the same way. Again, this prevents us from being comparative when we see our friends' children or we see the children that are in their classrooms. Kids have a lot of different ways that they can be intelligent, and it's not academic always in nature, and that's okay. Howard Gardner of Harvard University is the one that's credited with the theory of multiple intelligences. So some of you might have heard of the different types of intelligences. It's not just intellectual in nature, although there are some that are like that, like mathematical intelligence, verbal intelligence, but there's also musical intelligence. There's kinesthetic intelligence. They know how to use their body well. And they know how to use their body in a way that's, that's impressive. I don't have that intelligence, I don't think. That's why I'm not much of an athlete. I'm not very kinesthetic. Yeah, and that's all right. Exactly. Whoever said that, thanks, Will. That's exactly what we're trying to get across, is that it's all right if they don't have that intelligence, because they might be more interpersonally intelligent.
Yeah.
They might be good with people. I'll protect the innocent, but I've encouraged others before on how, or have recognized in others how well they are with other people. That's actually a talent, to be good with people and to have people gravitate to you quite naturally and to want to be your friend. And if you're the kind of person where everybody thinks you're their best friend, that's probably because you're interpersonally talented. People are drawn to you. Some people don't see that as a talent. I personally see that as a talent. And it's an intelligence. And it's something that not everybody has. And so we're not all going to have the same kinds of gifts. And our children are the same way. But we have to learn how to help our children identify their gifts. And giving them a lot of opportunities in a lot of different ways is a great way to do that. So even though you might be athletics, gung-ho, what's that? CrossFit, you're the CrossFit head, and that's your thing, don't limit your children just being involved in sports or, in athletic type of things. Even if you're not musical, get them involved in something musical, even if you're not, into, I don't know, one of the latest things I think that people are getting their kids into is coding, because the computer coding, yeah. Is that you, Judith? Or Xavier? Yeah, we got some coders in here. Those kind of things, like, I'm not into that, but that's the thing of the future. I mean, there's so many jobs that are available to people who have that skill. I'm not saying get them involved in coding, but hey, open that world up to them. Open the world of chess up to them, even if you don't know how to play chess. These are things that that we may not recognize in ourselves, but that doesn't limit them as an individualized person that they are. So we got to learn to help our children identify their gifts, give them lots of opportunities, notice ways that they do things that may not be an obvious. For instance, our oldest Gabriel is grown a lot in being good with Legos. I don't expect him to be a professional Lego sculptor one day. If he wants to be, there are people that do that. That's great. But there's skills inherent in that activity that not only is he's using, but he's using it in a way that he's actually enjoying what he's doing. So we got to learn to become intuitive to those things, or maybe not intuitive, but observant. That's a better word, of those different aspects of the activities that our children naturally gravitate to, and find ways to motivate them to go after that. Of course, we have, children that are really gung-ho and are quite temperamentally, almost like type A personalities. They're ready to go, try new things all the time. And you can't stop them, and you kind of have to rein that in, and you can't do everything. But then we also have the kids that are naturally more underachievers. And again, we got to go back to that scripture in Romans. We have to learn to accept all types. And sometimes our children are just kind of more bent that way. Maybe they're underachievers, not in everything. As we just talked about, there are multiple intelligences. But there are some ways, and sometimes that does come out most clearly for parents in the world of academics. So you might have a child that is not reaching their potential. And so we have to learn how to motivate them as well. Underachievement itself relates to the discrepancy between some measure of the child's ability and his or her actual achievement. So we see the ability there, and we know it's there, but they're not achieving at that level. Some aspects of an underachiever are they tend to be disorganized, they lose their assignments, they misplace their books, they daydream a lot, they forget to do their homework. That might indicate some other things that may need more. If you feel like that's to the extreme, I would encourage you to seek professional advice about where they're at. But sometimes that's just where a kid is at. They might spend more of their time and energy on watching television, playing computer games, getting on their iPhones, iPads. They often blame their teachers or school for their poor grades. And they often prioritize fun activities in their social life over academics. So, again, they might have strengths in some of those other areas, and that's why they're naturally bent in that way. But we want to help our kids do their best. We're always trying to help them achieve their best. And the danger of this is not so much that they don't achieve the grades that they can achieve, but more so what is happening to them psychologically if we allow them to stay in this place. So research has shown, underachievers often come to believe that they can't reach their goals, even if they work hard. Their feelings of defectiveness and failure are triggered at the thought of actually trying harder. So if they have a naturally surrendered coping style, which is the flight coping style, when they're faced with stress or something adversive, they fulfill the prophecy of their own inner voice that says they can't reach these goals. So what's kind of the dangerous line here with underachievers is that they can actually reinforce the belief in themselves that they can't achieve. Also, if underachievers don't think that they can win, sometimes they won't even bother trying. They essentially would rather not try than to try and be disappointed out of fear that their flaws will be exposed. So instead, sometimes they opt to brag about a low grade that they received instead of actually putting in the work to achieve more than that. And I've seen this with kids too, where they're like, yeah, at least a D is passing, that kind of attitude, And, for some kids, hey, if they've been getting Fs consistently, if they got up to a D, hey, let's encourage the work that they put in to get to the D. And let's, move in that direction, keep them moving incrementally in the right direction. But for some kids, that's just an excuse to make them feel better. But it's really not just, kind of feeling better cognitively, but feeling better emotionally about themselves. We have to be careful about that. Underachievers tend to have magical thinking. So they believe that later on in life, things are going to get better. Right now, yeah, I'm kind of just drudging through this thing called school and this thing called life. But one day, I'm going to have the bucks. One day, I'm going to have the ride. I'm going to have the fill in the blank with whatever it is. One day, it's going to happen for me, And I'll just make a personal confession that, I've had that in my life. Where I've kind of things aren't quite where I want them to be right now. But I can imagine, one day, they're going to get there. And what I find is, for myself, as I was preparing for this, I could see myself in that statement. That, instead of putting in the work to kind of go in the direction of the goals that I have, in my mind. I just imagine that one day it's going to happen. One day it's going to all come together, you know. And that's often what happens with our kids when they're not achieving at the level that they could be. So really, the advice for the underachiever is not to bang the pot and pan early in the morning, get them going up early, ask the teachers to push them harder and, send more homework home. And, it's not to ramp up the expectations, but this is actually a great way to use natural consequences and let natural consequences take their course. And this is kind of a scary place for us sometimes as parents, to allow our kids to kind of reap what they sow, so that, again, that intrinsic motivation is what's being affected, not the external motivation. So again, we don't need to necessarily, act like nothing is happening, but we could say, we could be empathetic. When they come back, with the poor grades, we could say, wow, man, that must be hard to have gotten that grade. And kind of see where that sits with them, and being empathetic. We don't have to say, wow, you really should have done this, or you should have done that, and that's actually not going to achieve what we want to achieve, but the natural consequences that are going to be laid on them, and again, this is more helpful when we start younger in life than expect this to happen later in life, but the natural consequences of what their teachers will do, what the other significant adults in their life are going to do when they aren't achieving at the level that they could be. That's kind of the realm that we should let that kind of take over. So we don't have to push and grind, basically. Let natural consequences take their effect, and stay there with your kids in it, though, as they're going through it and they're feeling the pain. Empathize with the pain, but you don't have to minimize it. Let them experience it. Let them become more responsible naturally, rather than you trying to artificially create motivation. The last one here is, don't let yourself jump to the worst case scenarios. So we talked about this sort of at the beginning, that when we have a mindset that when our children haven't done what we've expected them to do, that this is the end of the world kind of situation, that there's no hope for our child, there's this is it, we're going to reinforce some really poor things in our children. So a good question to ask ourselves is, what's the worst thing that could happen really if our child doesn't do X, Y, Z in a way that we expect them to? For instance, let's say, and this actually is a good example of where we have to do maybe a better job sometimes as the adults in the situation. But what's the worst case scenario if our child takes a bit more time to get dressed in the morning? We might have to be, depending on where our kids are at developmentally, be more on top of things to set them up for success. But, if they take a little bit more time, what's the worst that can really happen? One of the things that might happen is they might be late for the bus. Now, early on, if we let natural consequences take their course, when they're at a stage where they are curious, they like school, they like learning, they like to please their teachers, they like to be with their classmates, they miss the bus, and they miss school, or they are late to school, and there are consequences for that, there are going to be some natural repercussions that they're going to feel. What's the worst that could happen if they can't remember everything that they studied or that they were supposed to study for a test? What's the worst thing that could happen? Yeah, they miss some things on the test. Maybe they don't get the best grade that they could have gotten. But is it the end of the world? Is it something for us to become punitive and, to get over the top about, because now we think, they're never going to make anything of their lives because this one test was a poor grade. Some of us are laughing, but some of us think this way. Some of us react to our children this way when they don't do the things that we expect them to do. And so we have to be careful that we're not jumping to the worst case scenario. Children are going to make mistakes just as much as we make mistakes. So again, we have to come in with graciousness on this point of allowing our kids to make mistakes. The damage that kids cause when they make mistakes is typically nothing compared to the damage that parents will inflict on their children when they jump to the worst case scenario. Because what happens is, and especially if we exasperate in this way as a lifestyle, this creates memories that will stay with our kids for a lifetime. Whereas their mistakes, just like probably a lot of your mistakes, because we make more mistakes than we like to admit, most of those we don't even remember. I'm sure the majority of us, if not all of us, on April 5th, 2016, made some mistakes. Do you remember the mistake that you made on April 5th, 2016? No. Yeah. There's a lot you don't remember about that. But you might remember when your parent responded to a mistake or a failure that you had and they belittled you. They criticized you. They put you down. They said, you know what? You're just lazy. You're just never gonna get it together. When they said, oh my gosh, how are you ever gonna get into college? When you failed that test in first grade. Some of those things stick with us for a lifetime. And so, we have to be mindful that the way we respond to our kids, those things have a way of sticking to their memory very much. So we have to be careful about that. So in all these things, as we get ready to close out here, what we're working towards is this scripture here. When we're coming from a biblical, spiritual point of view, what we expect of our children will vary from household to household. So, I can't give you a blanket statement about things that you should expect from your kids. The one thing I will say that I didn't mention earlier, though, is when we talked about the domains last week, the different domains of decision making or right and wrong, the moral domain, the prudential domain, conventional, and personal. The most important areas that we need to focus on when it comes to expectations is the same one we talked about last week with our limits. And that's in the areas of morality, in the areas of prudential, which has to do with the well-being, the health and well-being of our kids. So what we expect of them and, who they are as a person in their character and how they take care of themselves, and that they are taking care of themselves and setting themselves up for success health-wise, is way more important than the conventional domain, which is basically that social norm or that maybe family cultural norm. If our expectation is that they always chew their food in a certain way, their expectation is that they always hang up their coat in the same spot every day and that they never fail to do that. When we focus in on those things and make those things the issue, we exasperate our children, and our expectations become unrealistic, and they become overbearing, and then they also tend to point to us as being hypocrites, because we tend to not do those things consistently all the time either. And we're setting ourselves up for failure and setting our kids up for failure. But what we're working towards ultimately is what it says here in Colossians 3, verse 23, is the heart that whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for men. Ultimately, that's the highest expectation that we want our kids to have intrinsically, is that what they're doing is for God, and not for success, not for achievement, not for this sterling reputation with everyone that they come in contact with, but that they're actually doing what's pleasing to God. And so, they may never achieve the six-figure salary. They may never get an award for anything that merits, community applause and, accolades. They may never win a championship. They may never, do these things that the world deems as successful, but if they're working at it for God and they're doing their best for God, we can celebrate that. And we want to celebrate that, just as we would celebrate that in one another. So I want to encourage, this to be sort of a supreme, scripture for us to take with us and to start teaching our children, even at a young age. That really what matters in life is what God thinks matters, and not all these other things. We want you to do your best in these things. We want you to have, feelings of success and confidence. But at the end of the day, if you know that God's pleased with you, you can be content. You can be happy. You can be joyful. You can be at peace. That's what we want to see happen. So, for time's sake, I'm not going to show the videos at the end here. I had some videos at the end. We're not going to show those. Maybe I'll have some videos for you next week. But we're getting close to wrapping up our core emotional needs. So we have one more, which is the one in the center. That's what we're going to be looking at next week. Barring me not being available because my third child is going to be coming any day. So hopefully we'll be available for that. If we're not, I'm sure John and Cliff will figure out something that we can do with that time that will be encouraging and uplifting and it will be impactful. But that's what we're looking for next week, is that middle core emotional need, which is the +1 need of spiritual values and community. And so hopefully this is helpful tonight. Again, sorry, I felt a little disoriented with my notes and such. So hopefully you got something good out of this. If not, and you want to extend things, and you don't have a book yet, we still have books on sale for $30. So definitely grab a book. There's way more information. It fleshes out things way more, and it's a great resource. But with that, I want to encourage you to, how much time, Doug? It's 8:20. Do we need to get our kids now?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So in 5 minutes, go ahead and get your kids. If you need to meet in your groups,